The sun over the high plains was a hammer that never tired. It pounded the earth until it cracked like old pottery and turned men's skin to leather. On days like this, the wind carried grit that found its way under clothes, in your mouth, in your eyes, as if the land itself didn't want you here. Thomas Boone had gotten used to the wind, the grit, and the way loneliness settled in his bones like an old injury. He'd run this ranch alone for 10 years now. Folks in town called him the ghost behind the gate, half out of spite, half out of pity. Some said he'd been a good man once, a wife, a baby girl, both buried under the lone cottonwood by the creek when a fever swept through. Since then, Thomas spoke mostly to his horses and the wind. That morning, he woke before the sun. He always did. It was the only way to get ahead of the heat and the chores that never ended. By mid-afternoon, he was patching up the north fence line, hammer in hand, hat pulled low against the glare. That's when he saw something move, just beyond the split rail fence. At first he thought it was a coyote, the way it crawled low, ribs showing through skin. But then it lifted its head, too round, too human, and he realized it was a boy. Barefoot, hair matted with dust and sweat, eyes wide like a cornered deer. Thomas set the hammer down, slow, careful not to startle him. The boy watched, unmoving, but his eyes kept flicking to the water canteen tied to Thomas's saddle. "Easy now," Thomas murmured, voice rough from disuse. "You thirsty?" The boy didn't answer, just stared. Thomas unhooked the canteen, took a swig to show it was safe, then held it out. The boy's eyes darted to the fence, to the horse, then to the canteen. He didn't move. Thomas sighed. He glanced back at the house, a gray speck against the brown land. If any of the neighbors saw this, a white rancher handing water to some half-wild boy, the gossip would spread like brushfire. Didn't matter. He pushed the canteen through the fence. The boy snatched it, nearly dropped it from the weight, then lifted it to his mouth like it was life itself. Water spilled down his chin and neck. He drained it dry in seconds. "You got a name, boy?" Thomas asked. Nothing. Just those big eyes, now wary again. Thomas knew that look. Hunger and fear tangled together. He'd seen it in the mirror once, long ago. He pointed toward the house. "You want food? You come with me." The boy hugged the empty canteen to his chest like a promise. He looked at the open prairie behind him, then at Thomas's hand. One step, another, bare feet kicking up dust that clung to his bony ankles. They walked, slow. Thomas led the horse with one hand, the boy trailing a few paces behind. Every time the wind shifted, the boy flinched, like he expected someone, or something, to come riding over the ridge and drag him away. Inside the house, Thomas built a small fire in the cook stove. The boy stood by the door, ready to bolt. Thomas took out what little he had: beans, a stale hunk of bread, a bit of salted pork. He made a plate and set it on the table. "Eat." Still nothing. The boy's eyes flicked from the food to the door, to Thomas. His shoulders shook like he'd been whipped too many times to trust an open hand. Thomas sat down across from him, pushing the plate closer. "I ain't gonna hurt you, son." The word son tasted strange on his tongue, but it felt right. The boy stared, then lunged for the bread. He tore at it with his teeth, crumbs spilling down his front. Thomas watched, fighting the urge to weep. He hadn't realized how long it had been since this kitchen held another heartbeat. When the boy finally slowed, belly round with food and warmth, his eyelids drooped. Thomas pointed to the small cot by the window, once his daughter's. He didn't say anything. The boy crawled onto it, curling up like a stray pup. In minutes, he was asleep. Thomas sat in the creaking chair by the stove, hat in his hands. The flames danced shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind moaned through the dry grass. He thought of what folks would say when they found out, what trouble might come. White men didn't take in Indian strays without paying for it. But then he looked at the boy's tiny shape under the thin blanket, how he trembled even in sleep. And for the first time in years, Thomas Boone felt something other than emptiness settle in his chest. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it would cost him everything he still had. But as the wind rattled the window, Thomas whispered to the ghosts of his wife and daughter, "Reckon we got room for one more." Morning broke sharp and cold, the kind that reminded Thomas Boone that even the sun could bite when the seasons turned. He found the boy still curled on the cot, breathing so light it was a wonder he hadn't drifted away on the night wind. For a moment, Thomas let himself stand there, hat pressed to his chest, like a father checking on a child who'd had a bad dream. When the boy woke, he didn't speak. He never did. He just watched Thomas with those wide eyes, flinching at sudden movements but never leaving the doorway once he'd crossed it. Thomas cooked a pot of mush, set out a tin cup of milk, and pretended he didn't see the boy pocket an extra piece of bread for later. They settled into a rhythm that first week. Thomas fixed fences, mucked stalls, hauled water. The boy trailed behind him like a wary shadow, sometimes holding a tool, sometimes just watching. He didn't know a word of English, far as Thomas could tell. Or maybe he did but refused to share it. Still, the boy's hands worked, feeding the horses handfuls of hay, sweeping the dirt floor of the barn with a broom twice his size. Late one afternoon, Thomas spotted a rider cresting the south ridge, silhouetted against the pale sky, dust trailing his horse's hooves. Thomas squinted. Judson Webb, a neighbor of sorts. Man who liked to talk more than he liked to listen. "Boone!" Judson called, reining up at the gate. "Ain't seen you in town for a spell." Thomas kept his voice level. "Been busy." Judson's eyes drifted past him, squinting at the barn door. The boy stood half hidden in the shadows, clutching a brush he'd been using on the old mare. "That an orphan you got there?" Judson asked, spitting a brown stream of tobacco. "He looks like one of them breed kids. You know, Apache." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He shrugged. "Hungry's what he is. I fed him." Judson's grin was the kind that never reached his eyes. "That's so. You reckon his people'll come looking? You know how they get, always wanting something back." Thomas stepped closer to the gate, resting one hand on it. "Don't see how that's your concern, Judd." Judson leaned in, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. "Word'll spread, Boone. You know how folks talk. White man keeping a redskin boy. Some might think you're setting yourself up for trouble. Might think you gone soft in the head." Thomas felt heat rise in his throat. He'd been called worse than soft before, but never for doing what felt right. "Let 'em talk." Judson laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Suit yourself. Just don't come crying to us when the sheriff comes asking questions, or when his kin come creeping through your fields at night." He tugged the reins, turning his horse back toward the ridge. The boy hadn't moved. He just stared after Judson, eyes dark as thunderclouds. When the dust settled, Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He walked back to the barn, took the brush from the boy's small hand, and knelt so they were eye to eye. "Men like him talk too much. Don't you fret. You got a place here long as you want it." The boy's chin trembled. For a heartbeat, Thomas thought he might speak, but instead he turned and busied himself with the mare's flank. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, shotgun resting across his knees. He thought about his wife, about the baby girl whose giggle still echoed when the wind was right. He wondered if this boy, this half-wild, half-starved ghost, was some final chance to atone for all he hadn't done, all he'd failed to protect. In the dark, coyotes yipped on the far hills. Inside the barn, the horses stirred. And in the hush between heartbeats, Thomas could almost hear another sound, the faintest rhythm of a boy's breath, steady as a promise. It was near dusk when Thomas first spotted the tracks, just faint impressions in the hard-packed dirt by the north pasture, half covered by wind-blown grass. Bare feet, small but sure. He knew the boy's prints now. These were not his. These were different, lighter, watching. He squatted by the fence post, fingertips tracing the outline before the wind wiped it clean. The boy hovered behind him, clutching a bucket of water for the horses. His eyes, wide as always, darted from the tracks to Thomas's face, as if waiting for him to say what he already feared. "Someone's been here," Thomas said, mostly to himself. Watching. He didn't mean to frighten the boy, but the boy tensed anyway, shoulders pulled tight as a drawn bow. Thomas forced a tired smile, tousling the boy's tangled hair. "Ain't nothing gonna hurt you, son, long as I got breath." But deep inside, a worry took root and refused to let go. 2 days later, the sheriff came calling. Sheriff Dunn was a man built like a fence post, long, thin, all edges and splinters. He rode up slow, boots creaking in the stirrups, eyes hidden by the brim of his hat. "Boone," he called, voice as dry as last year's riverbed. Thomas set down his feed sack. The boy ducked behind the barn, just out of sight. "Sheriff," Thomas said, nodding. "What brings you out this far?" Dunn dismounted, dust puffing under his boots. He didn't bother with small talk. "Heard you took in a stray. Little Injun boy. That true?" Thomas crossed his arms over his chest. "Boy was starving. I fed him. Folks are uneasy. Some say you're harboring trouble. Say his people might think you stole him, that they'll come for him." Thomas snorted. "Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. Either way, he stays." Dunn spat into the dirt. "Boone, you always been stubborn. You lost enough. You want to lose that place too? There's men in town who'd love to carve it up. All they need's an excuse." Thomas stepped forward, close enough to smell the whiskey on Dunn's breath. "That boy's done nothing wrong. I won't turn him out." Dunn's eyes flicked past Thomas's shoulder, catching a glimpse of the boy's head peeking around the barn's edge. "You best pray his kinfolk see it that way, or that they don't come down off them ridges one night looking for blood." Thomas didn't flinch. "Then let 'em come." When the sheriff was gone, the boy crept out, clutching the hem of Thomas's shirt. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, he pointed at the ridgeline beyond the pasture. Thomas followed his gaze. There, silhouetted against the bleeding sunset, stood a single rider on horseback, motionless, watching. Thomas felt a chill crawl down his spine despite the dying heat of the day. He rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "They're here for you, ain't they?" The boy's eyes glistened in the failing light. For the first time, he placed his small hand over Thomas's. A promise, an apology, a bond. The wind carried the last of the day's warmth away. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes began their mournful song. But Thomas Boone, the ghost behind the gate, felt something different stir in his chest. Resolve. If the Apache came, so be it. He would face them like he faced every storm that ever crossed these plains. He looked down at the boy, pulling him close against his side. "Long as I stand on this dirt, they'll have to go through me to take you." Above them, the lone rider turned his horse, melting back into the dusk, like a shadow fading into the land that had birthed him. The days grew short, as autumn leaned in hard, turning the nights brittle and the dawns sharp as broken glass. The cottonwoods around Boone's ranch dropped their leaves early, leaving the branches black and crooked against the pale sky. Every dusk seemed to bring a new whisper on the wind, a rustle that might have been a coyote or something more human, pacing just beyond the fence line. Inside the house, Thomas felt that watchful weight in every creak of the floorboards. He'd grown used to loneliness filling every room. Now the boy's soft footfalls, the scrape of a bowl on the table, the faint breaths in the dark, they made the house feel alive again. And yet each sound reminded him how easily this fragile warmth could be snatched away. The boy said nothing of the mark drawn in the dust by the old barn, but Thomas caught him tracing it with his finger each dawn, as if it were a tether to something far away. Some nights, Thomas woke to find him sitting by the window, eyes fixed on the ridgeline where the dark met the stars. Trouble always finds the smallest crack to crawl through. It came on a Friday night, when the wind cut raw, and the stars overhead looked like cold pinpricks in a dying blanket. Thomas was splitting firewood when he heard horses snorting, hooves drumming the earth too fast for neighborly calling. Jesse Boyd and his brothers, 3 mean shapes on horseback, lanterns swaying from their saddlebags, rifles slung across shoulders like vipers waiting to strike. Thomas knew Jesse from the old cattle drives, back when they'd both been young enough to dream. Jesse'd always had a mean streak, the kind that curdles when it goes unchecked too long. "Boone," Jesse barked, voice echoing off the empty barn. "Come on out, we're talking business tonight." Thomas stepped into the lantern light, the boy just a shadow behind him in the doorway. The wind caught the boy's hair, wild and black as a crow's wing. He looked too small to stand against these men, but he stood there all the same. "What business?" Thomas asked, slow and steady. He kept the axe in one hand, balanced casual across his shoulder. Jesse smirked, spitting tobacco. "That stray you got. Word is he's drawing trouble. My cattle gone missing. Tracks point this way. Some folks say his people been creeping through the brush taking what ain't theirs." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Your fence is rotting in 3 places, Jesse. Maybe your cattle just wandered. Or maybe you're looking for a reason to stir shit." One of Jesse's brothers, a mean stump of a man with teeth like gravestones, sneered. "Folks don't like it, Boone. You feeding a breed boy like he's your own. Makes you look soft. Makes the rest of us look weak." Thomas stepped down off the porch, boots crunching frost-laced dirt. He met Jesse's eyes, and for a heartbeat, they both remembered nights on the trail. Whiskey passed hand to hand, dreams of carving ranches out of nothing. "You come here to talk, you talk. You come here to threaten. You best finish that thought before I finish it for you." A flicker of something passed over Jesse's face. Anger or regret, it was hard to tell. He shifted in his saddle, eyes flicking to the ridgeline behind Boone's barn. The boy stepped out, bare feet pressing the cold ground. He moved to stand beside Thomas, small hand wrapping around the man's weathered coat. It was such a quiet gesture, but it cut deeper than any blade. A promise. He's mine, and I am his. Jesse's brother started to laugh, but it choked off in his throat. There, up on the ridge, a shape materialized out of the dark. A horseman, feathered lance catching the moonlight like silver. Then another, and another. Silent as stones, they lined the ridge like ghosts carved from the land itself. "Christ," Jesse breathed. "You think you're safe 'cause they're watching? Maybe they're just waiting to carve you up too." Thomas turned just enough to see the boy's eyes. Calm, steady now, no more flinching. The boy lifted his chin, and in that moment, with the Apache riders behind him and Jesse's hate in front, he found his voice. "Father." One word. Soft. But the way it fell between the men was like iron striking stone. Thomas's throat burned. He dropped the axe into the dirt, placed a hand on the boy's thin shoulder. "You heard him. He stays. And you best remember your place in the dark, Jesse Boyd. Some things you can't scare off with lanterns and whiskey breath." Jesse's face twisted, torn between fury and fear. He looked back at those silent riders, not moving, not speaking, just watching, and he knew, deep down in his mean heart, that he'd lost more than this fight. "You're gonna regret this, Boone," Jesse hissed, but his voice cracked like rotting wood. "Maybe," Thomas said, his voice low, "but not tonight." When they turned their horses and rode out, the prairie swallowed their curses like dry leaves. The only sound left was the wind scraping across the ridgeline, and the soft, steady breathing of a boy who, for the first time, knew he was safe. Thomas lifted the boy into his arms, carrying him back toward the warmth of the flickering lamplight. He paused at the porch, looking back once more. The Apache riders remained on the ridge, silhouettes against the bruised sky, keeping their silent vigil. And as the first rim of dawn brushed the edge of the world, Thomas Boone, the ghost behind the gate, finally allowed himself to believe. The barn, the boy, the land, they were his again, and they would never stand alone. By the time November's chill set its claws into the plains, Thomas Boone's breath came out in white plumes that hung in the air like ghosts. The old ranch house smelled of wood smoke and coffee, things that reminded him he still had a home worth protecting. Each dawn, he rose before the sun, raked the ashes from the stove, fed the stock, and now, there was always a second pair of small hands beside him. The boy worked without being told. He learned to scatter feed for the hens, patch gaps in the fence with baling wire, even rub liniment into the old mare's tired legs. Sometimes, Thomas caught him standing by the window at dusk, watching the horizon where the ridgeline met the bruised sky, waiting, maybe, for shadows that meant safety, not fear. Some nights, Thomas told him stories by the hearth, just quiet words about the girl he'd buried, the woman he'd loved. He didn't know if the boy understood every word, but the way he leaned close, eyes reflecting the flicker of the flames, told Thomas it didn't matter. It was on one of those nights, when the wind howled down from the hills like a wounded wolf, that trouble knocked its boots at the gate again. Thomas was stacking fresh logs by the barn door when he heard it, a twig snapping where no hoof or boot should be. He sucked in a breath, every nerve wired for the possibility that this was just the wind playing tricks. But the boy appeared at his side a heartbeat later, bare feet silent on frozen dirt, eyes wide and dark as coal. Thomas touched the boy's cheek, felt it cold and damp from the wind. "Back inside, son," he whispered, but the boy shook his head. He pointed instead, 2 fingers at the pasture fence. Shapes moved there, shifting like oil in moonlight. Men on foot this time. Smart enough not to ride up loud. Smart enough to think they could catch Thomas Boone sleeping. Thomas motioned the boy behind a stack of hay bales, then eased the old hunting rifle from its hooks. The barn smelled of old straw and warm horseflesh, but under that was something sharper, the bite of fear that comes when a man knows he's outnumbered. He heard the creak of the gate, the low hush of a voice telling the others to spread wide. The boy pressed a rusty hammer into Thomas's palm, as if the rifle wasn't enough. Thomas nearly laughed, and nearly wept at the same time. This slip of a child, offering him a tool like it might hold back the dark. A boot scraped the dirt just outside the barn wall. Thomas froze. The boy leaned forward, almost stepping from his cover. Thomas hissed, "No." But the boy's eyes were fierce, a fire that no hunger or cold could snuff out. A lantern flared to life outside, shadows swinging wild across the barn wall. 3 men, rifles in hand, faces half covered by bandanas. Thomas recognized the tallest, Boyd's cousin, mean as a snake and twice as dumb. The kind who'd kill for the brag. They muttered to each other, not seeing the small eyes watching them through the slats. Not seeing the shapes moving far beyond them, up on the ridgeline. The first gunshot was never fired. Instead, the night answered in a hush, the sudden snort of a horse, the rhythmic thump of hooves, but not theirs. On the far side of the pasture, a single rider appeared, tall in the saddle, spear rising like a thorn against the moon. Then another, and another. They came from the north and the east, slipping from the cottonwoods like the dark itself had grown a spine. One by one, the Apache riders took their place, forming a silent ring that swallowed the men whole. No war cries, no rattles or painted faces, just steady, patient eyes that promised death without a single wasted word. Inside the barn, Thomas crouched by the boy's side, heart pounding. The boy's breath came in quick bursts, but his hand never left Thomas's sleeve. Together they peeked through the boards and watched the circle tighten. The would-be rustlers spun, rifles half raised. But who would you shoot when every tree line now carried a horseman? When every gust of wind might be the next ghost rising up? One dropped his gun outright, stumbled back so hard he fell in the dirt. Another broke and ran, straight into the waiting line of riders who parted just enough to let him know he'd been spared. For now, Boyd's cousin stayed longest, cursing under his breath, spitting into the frost. But in the end, he too turned tail, the lantern clattering from his hand as he vanished into the black. The Apache didn't give chase. They never needed to. Their silence was the only lesson any fool needed. When it was over, Thomas opened the barn door. The wind slapped him cold, but he stood tall, rifle at his side. The boy pressed close to his leg, eyes wide but unafraid. The ring of riders lingered. Some looked straight at Thomas, and for the first time, he felt no barrier in that gaze. No threat, only an understanding. You kept our blood. We keep yours. A single rider at the forefront, older, face painted by the same wind that carved these hills, raised his chin in a nod. The boy slipped forward, stepped past Thomas, and stood at the barn door, facing his people. He lifted his small hand to his chest, then to Thomas's side. An oath. A bridge. And then the circle broke. Riders turning as one, melting back into the cottonwoods, hooves whispering through frost-kissed grass. They left no footprints that the wind wouldn't cover by dawn. When the sun rose, Thomas found himself standing in the yard, boots frozen to the dirt. He looked at the barn, the fences, the cottonwoods rattling in the wind, and at the boy still at his side, jaw set like a man twice his age. "Son," Thomas said, voice cracked with sleep and awe, "I reckon we ain't alone anymore." The boy said nothing. He didn't have to. He only leaned into Thomas's side, small hand slipping into the big one that would hold his forever. And somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the watchers waited, silent, patient, loyal. As long as this land stayed true to the promise a lonely rancher made under the cold, star-choked sky. Years have a way of carving themselves into the land. By the time Thomas Boone's hair turned white as prairie snow, the old ranch had seen more seasons than any man could count. Spring storms battered the fence lines to splinters. Summer sun baked the earth until it cracked. Autumn winds rattled the cottonwoods like bones in a drum. And through it all, the boy, his son, stood steady. the way Thomas once had when the world was just dust and hope. The house grew warm again. Laughter returned to its kitchen. The boy learned to speak English first in whispers, then in the barter house down in town, and finally across the pages of books that Thomas ordered one by one from the East. By the time he was 20, his name was ink on shipping ledgers and cattle contracts. By 25, his hands were firm on the reins of the ranch, driving the herds to market, sealing deals with men who no longer dared look down on the breed boy they'd once called a stray. The barn, that weathered old refuge, never lost its place. Its roof sagged under heavy snows. Its doors creaked like old bones in the wind, but the family never tore it down. Some nights, when the wind carried the smell of rain and the cottonwoods leaned low, Thomas's son would slip inside with his own boy, small and wide-eyed, and lay a hand on the old boards. "This," he'd say, voice deep and quiet, "is where I found my father, and where he found me." Word spread the way stories do out here, half rumor and half gospel truth. A few ranch hands who drifted through claimed they saw more than they cared to name. Riders who appeared on moonless nights, standing watch where the fence met the wild. Some said the Apache had long forgotten Boone's kindness. But the truth was quieter than legend. Each generation, a handful of young braves took turns riding the ridges at dusk, a promise carried in the hooves of their ponies, that no man who fed their blood would stand alone when the wind turned cruel. Thomas lived to see gray hairs in his son's beard. He lived to see a second child born, a girl with his late wife's eyes, running barefoot through the pasture with dogs chasing her laughter. He lived to see storms flatten the wheat, but never the house. Droughts came and went, cattle prices rose and fell, but the old barn never stood empty, not once. Some evenings, when his knees ached too much for the porch chair, Thomas sat by the window. Outside, the pasture rolled out like an old quilt, patched with sagebrush and prairie grass, hemmed in by the same ridgeline that had once delivered a boy into his arms. On those nights, he swore he still heard hoofbeats. The dogs never barked when they came. They'd just lift their heads, ears forward, tails still, as if they too knew these shadows were no threat. The last winter came soft, a thin dusting of snow, a sun that never warmed the porch boards, the air sharp and clean. Thomas's breath rattled in his chest like loose fence wire. His son sat by his bed, strong hands wrapped around his. "You gave me everything," the son said. "Everything, Father." Thomas tried to speak but found only air and memory. His eyes drifted to the window, where the frost traced the glass like old scars. Out past the pasture, beyond the cottonwoods, he saw them. A line of riders in silhouette, lances tilted skyward, feathers lifting in the hush of the wind. Not spirits, not ghosts, just men as real as any other, paying their respects to a man who'd given a starving child shelter when no one else would. He closed his eyes, the weight of the blanket light compared to the warmth of a hand on his chest. His son's hand, now bigger, stronger, but the same. Outside, the barn stood silver in the dawn light. Somewhere in its old beams, the breath of that first night, a boy, hungry and wild, and a rancher too lonely to keep the door shut, still lingered like the smell of hay after a rain. They buried Thomas Boone under the cottonwood beside his wife, near the creek that never once ran dry in his lifetime. The boy, now a man, now a father himself, stood with his family and with the watchers who drifted down from the ridge, silent, respectful, proud. And when the service was done and the mourners gone, the Apache riders lingered a while longer, sitting their horses under the trees until the sun dipped below the plains, and the first stars came out to keep vigil with them. Long after, folks passing down that road at dusk sometimes claim they see them still, a ring of silent riders guarding a crooked old barn. Some say it's just a story, a shadow caught in the mind's eye. But the people who live there, the family who never turned a hungry soul away, they know better. They know the prairie never forgets the man who gave more than he ever took. And they know that as long as the wind rattles the cottonwoods and the stars wheel over the ridge, the old barn will never stand alone in the dark.